Alrighty, so I chose to do my final paper on challenges to Indigenous food security in the Arctic, and it's kind of what my overarching master's project is looking towards is food security. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So first, just going to do a brief introduction on what food security actually is and just a little bit more about the background. And then looking at the research question and then the challenges that I've kind of identified through that research question, which is climate change, economic challenges, and contaminants, and then recommendations that I've kind of found through my research. So first, so what exactly is food security? So the International Food Policy Research Institute presents food security as defined by the UN as meaning that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life. Taking that one step further, the ICC in their food security summary and recommendations for Alaska describes Indigenous food security as the natural right of all Inuit to be a part of the ecosystem, to access food, and to caretake, protect, and respect all of life, land, water, and air. It allows for Inuit to obtain, process, store, and consume sufficient amounts of healthy and nutritious preferred food. And these are foods that are physically, and spiritually craved and needed from the land, air, and water, which provide for families and future generations through the practice of Inuit customs and spirituality, languages, knowledge, policies, management practices, and self-governance. So through this kind of framework, the ICC establishes that value of food for Indigenous communities and how that really far exceeds the monetary and nutritional values. So they set forth that, food is a vital part of cultural identity through which the past and present are connected. So then to kind of jump into the research question that I addressed in this paper is how is Indigenous food security challenged by changes in the Arctic region? And I feel like this question is important because the Arctic, as we know through all of our coursework, is changing at an unprecedented rate, and it's affecting the way in which Indigenous peoples of the Arctic survive. And so by examining how those changes in the Arctic are challenging food security for Indigenous populations of the region, we can better understand how to mitigate against or prevent these changes. And so, as I kind of touched on before, not only is this, food security vital, for physical health, but there's also a lot of social and mental factors that play into this. And one source that I read, a leader from ICC Alaska noted that people here are identified by their ability to hunt and provide food for those who need it. So in other words, Indigenous identity in the Arctic is largely dependent on their abilities to provide for themselves and their communities. And when they're unable to do this, they suffer more than just being physically hungry. There's also that social and mental well-being access that kind of plays into it. And I think that also ties back into the definition that the ICC sets forth for food security, and that it's foods that are physically and spiritually craved and needed from the land, air, and water, which provide for families and future generations. So not only, is food security important for physical, spiritual, and mental health. It's also really important for the promotion and continuation of cultural practices. And so children are taught from an early age the importance of a subsistence lifestyle. Um, in these communities, food takes on a deeper meaning than just physical nourishment. There's also that spiritual aspect that's deeply rooted within Indigenous cultures. And by continuing that traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering practices, Indigenous communities are upholding their cultural values that have been passed down, for generations from their ancestors. So there's a lot of, challenges related to food security in the Arctic, far beyond what these three are, but I think these three can kind of be generalized as like the main categories. And for the purpose of this paper, these are the ones that I'm going to focus on. So the first one is going to be climate change. And that, can be a huge challenge for food security in the Arctic, because it influences the availability of wildlife, and the ability of the hunters to access that wildlife safely. So when we look at like changes in temperature and how that has resulted in the melting of sea ice, not only is the coverage of sea ice decreasing, but also the thickness of the ice and what's actually there. And so as one of my sources noted, the Arctic melt is having a profoundly negative impact on many Indigenous hunters who have for millennia relied on the pursuit of whales, seals, fish, and land mammals such as caribou to feed their families. So, changes in the Arctic have resulted in perilous conditions for hunters, which has led to a decline in their ability to successfully hunt. And this kind of also relates to changes in migration routes. So, as sea ice melts, as the climate and the environment start to change, the wildlife is changing, their habits and their migration routes. And so, people have to go further to hunt and find food. So then the next one is economic challenges. And there's a lot that falls into this category as well, but just kind of like the highlight. So one of the biggest ones being is now in a lot of these remote communities in the Arctic, you see a mixture of cash and subsistence economies. So not only are people kind of they're dependent on wage work for money, they're also dependent on their tradition subsistence lifestyles for food. And so when you combine that with like lower income levels within those communities and limited of economic opportunity and resources, so limited job opportunities that are able to provide a livable wage, and then throw in the increased price in fuel and supplies. And like I said earlier, traditional hunters, they have to travel further to access wildlife, because not only were possibly former routes inaccessible due to climate change, but also because the wildlife has changed their habits and migration patterns. And so the ICC, so the Inuit Circumpolar Council in Greenland, conducted a survey that showed that traditional foods are a widely consumed component of Indigenous people's diets, and that these foods are highly valued, spiritually, culturally, and financially. And because of economic constraints, such as the high cost of fuel and supplies, access to these traditional foods is very limited. So in many of these communities, there's a mixed economy that's based on cash and subsistence, like I said. So, again, circling back, due to that low income and limited access to, economic opportunities and resources, people suffer to survive financially, and that is a ripple effect into, access to food, um, and how that affects, not only physical health like we've talked about, but also spiritual and mental and social well-being as well. And then the third challenge that I identified, and like I said, there's so many more, but for the sake of this paper, the third one I identified was contaminants. So the Arctic traditionally has been famous for its pristine and untouched environment, but this has been threatened, however, by contaminants in traditional foods. And so these contaminants, such as mercury and persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, are a result of variety of activities relating to long range atmospheric and aquatic transport, and bioaccumulation and biomagnification through marine food webs. So the ICC reported that researchers have actually found higher amounts of chemicals in the blood and tissues of indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And so marine mammals and fish are among the most highly contaminated, especially as you go up the further the food chain. And these contaminants can pose, serious health risks to indigenous peoples living in the Arctic region. As Gibson et al., one of my sources, they highlight exposure to environmental contaminants through traditional diet remains one of the risks to human health in the Arctic. Many of the marine mammals and fish in the Arctic are some of the most contaminated. And then another one of my sources notes that low level exposure to neurotoxins such as mercury from maternal seafood consumption may place the fetus at risk for neurodevelopmental outcomes. Sorry. So the main issue with these contaminants is, traditional foods from subsistence lifestyles. And this is because, subsistence practices are not subject to the same regulations as the industrial agri-food industry. And since subsistence is such a fundamental part of indigenous cultures in the Arctic, this can be a huge threat to not only their food security in the region, but also just their general overall health. So, not only these foods are very important to them, but also there's this underlying risk that their foods are contaminated. So trying to mitigate against that and prevent that is a huge challenge for food security in the Arctic. So recommendations, and again, just to kind of reiterate, like there's so many more, but again, just for like the scope of this paper, just a few. The two, the main highlight being is that there needs to be an increased cooperation and awareness at the community, regional, national, and international levels, particularly like cooperation and community involvement and co-production, to be able to develop culturally appropriate and relevant recommendations, strategies, and solutions. So one of my sources, they argue that the equitable inclusion of local knowledge and ways of knowing are critical to developing culturally relevant information that can be translated to action, like policy and programming at the local level, because that's where, the problems and the issue are being felt the most, but that's also where change is going to happen and have the most impact. So it's really important that, the acknowledgement of the right to food is the responsibility of everyone, including national governments and international organizations, but that there is this holistic approach to promote food security among indigenous peoples in the Arctic, and, and being able to work with the community and co-production for those culturally appropriate and relevant recommendations, strategies, and solutions. So to kind of wrap it up, that's what my paper talked about. Like I said, there's so much more that could go into it. But again, for the scope of this paper for the course, I kind of decided to just focus on my main, research question, which how is Indigenous food security challenged by changes in the Arctic region? And then through that kind of talked about the changes in climate, economic challenges, and contaminants, and then moved into some broader recommendations for those challenges. So that is all. Thank you for watching, and